Hey everyone, we are here to cover the end of March 1990, and hoo boy, if you thought last episode was a stinker, just wait until you get a load of this one. And I'm sorry this episode took so long, relatively speaking, but I've had a lot going on with my personal life, and I've been trying to get a head start on episodes 59 and 60, which are just both so huge. I mean, after those two, episode 61 is going to be like just footage of my funeral, I suspect. I will have died from playing too many 1990 video games. However, for today we have, I don't know, sports games, a couple forgotten JRPGs, some games for little kids, some British gaming, and a couple game show games. And one of those game show games has kind of like a weird twist. A weird epilogue that might get a little rude, so make sure you lock up the kids and wives. And one last thing, I made a guest appearance on Cinema Oblivia, a new podcast from James Eldridge, where we discuss Seeds, the 1968 cinematic sleaze fest from cult director Andy Milligan. I'll put a link in the comments, and also make sure the kids are out of the room while you're listening to it. You might know James from his appearances on Retronauts and from his co-hosting the prog rock podcast, Alexander's Ragtime Band, with Jeremy Parrish. You see, kids, these things are all like interbred. You gotta be like a member of the retro gaming mafia to get in on these things. And I'm also a guest on the Video Game History Hour podcast, which is the official podcast of the Video Game History Foundation. You guys probably all know Frank and Kelsey, and this episode is just a very chill hour or so of chatting about Chrontendo and related matters. There's also a link below for this one as well. Alright, so let's get started in late March 1990. Alright, let's clean up the last of the March 1990 games, starting with Majin, Eiyuuden, Wataru, Gaiden, an RPG from Hudson. As you will recall, Hudson was releasing games for both the Famicom and the PC Engine at the same time. And while the PC Engine was clearly Hudson's main focus, they did occasionally toss out an Adventure Island or a Bomberman game for Nintendo's platform. This, however, is an anime game developed by West One, or Westone, however it's pronounced. It's pretty obscure, but there has been a complete English translation done. As far as JRPGs go, this is kind of stripped down. No idea what the budget or development time was on this, but it definitely feels like a quick cash-in game. Now, if I told you this game is heavily Zelda influenced, you'd say, yeah, cool, that's awesome. Hold on though, I have some bad news. This game has a very heavy Zelda 2 influence. Yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, you do not play as the protagonist, Wataru. Instead, you are some anonymous mook who just happened to see Wataru get captured, and then his robot buddy Ryujin Maru asks you for your help to rescue him. Naturally, this is done by wandering all over the entire planet, exploring dungeons, and fighting powerful enemies every so often, which are colloquially referred to as bosses. Along the way, you will encounter lots of gold and treasure lying around, and you will need to buy weapons for your robot. If you're thinking, hey, this looks like it might just be based on an anime, then you are 100% correct. Machine Hero Wataru was an animated TV series produced by Sunrise, which ran from 1988 to 1989, but has been revived multiple times since then. The actual cartoon looks pretty terrible, but it was apparently pretty popular in Japan and China. This is the second game we've seen based on this series. That's right, the first was released in 1988 for the PC Engine and famously localized for the TurboGrafx-16 as Keith Courage in Alpha Zones. That game is generally considered to not be very good, and the Famicom game follows in those footsteps. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not utter trash like last episode's Sansara Naga, it's just okay. I mean, there's a lot of RPGs for the NES, and I'm not sure you want to waste your time playing this one. You start off visiting the local village, which is so small I don't even think it qualifies as a village. The locals give you some hints about what to do. Battles are random and are fought almost exactly like in Zelda 2. During these battles you actually control the robot, not the human guy. You just stab dudes with your dagger. Yes, despite being a robot, you don't have any guns or lasers or anything. You fight with a dagger, and you also have magic spells. Later enemies will be more difficult, with the ability to jump, fly, or shoot projectiles at you. Before too long, you go into a very sparsely designed dungeon, and sparsely designed is actually a pretty good description of the entire game. Obviously, not every RPG has the development time of Dragon Quest IV, but this game just kind of feels sort of empty. The first boss is defeated by making sure you have your MP completely full and just spamming the fire attack at him. Your reward is a slip spell, which allows you to escape from a battle or from a dungeon. Learning magic is odd. The spell is placed in your inventory, then you need to open up your items, find the spell, and use it. This is what actually gives you the magic ability, which always has a different name than the actual spell item that you collected. So for example, using slip spell will grant you the escape spell. It's weird because you only have one party member, so it's not like you can pass the spell to someone else in your party so that that specific character gets the spell. I don't know why the spells need to be items to begin with. The screen layout really bugs me. Obviously JRPGs use windows when you do things like open your inventory or whatever, but here there's these two large windows that take up like a third of the screen. The right hand side shows your health, money, and magic points, while the left just shows you the name of the area that you're currently in. I don't know why this information needs to be visible on the screen at all times. Another annoying thing, rather than the background smoothly scrolling as you move, the overworld is divided into a checkerboard. Once you reach the edge of one of the squares, you freeze for a second, then the background scrolls so that you're in the next square. This makes it hard to find your way around. I had a hard time finding the shop in the village since you actually have to enter the specific square on the grid in order to find it. Also, all the buildings are just generic houses that pretty much look the same from the outside, so you can't really tell an inn from a weapon shop. The king promises you the princess's hand if you defeat Tinbot, who isn't even hanging out in a dungeon or anything, he's just in one of the houses in this village. After you defeat him, you'll get a power spell, which allows you to move this rock that's blocking your way so that you can move on to the next area, Icefield. Again, this isn't terrible, it's just sort of bland and empty. I do hate the random battles, especially when you have jumping or flying enemies. Your robot can jump, but he can't fly. It's apparently quite short. A video playthrough of this I found was only around 5 hours long. So this game is, as you kids would say nowadays, basic. Okay, we've got a few games released on March 30th, then we'll wrap up March with a few Western releases. Well, here's one from Tacoma Shoten, who, as you recall, is primarily a book and magazine publisher, who had also diversified into music, cartoons, and video games. Power Soccer seems to be an almost completely forgotten game, even in Japan. It's also a game that I found to be pretty unremarkable. It is a very generic soccer game. Alright, so let's start by choosing our teams. They have names like eagles, sharks, buffaloes, that kind of stuff. Choose your formation. Don't know if this makes any difference. You know, there's basically two types of soccer games. The kind where the field is orientated vertically, and the kind where the field is orientated horizontally, such as Nintendo's soccer game. For those of you who can't see the screen, or who are just listening to the audio in order to fall asleep, let me assure you that in this game the field is vertical. Controls are very simple. One button switches between players when playing defense, and the other will let you try to steal the ball. When playing offense, one button passes the ball to another player and the other shoots. That's it. When the guy with the ball gets close to the goal, the view will zoom in, and if you're playing defense, you will automatically take control of the goalie. The art here is actually pretty nice. I like the way the goalie falls flat on his face here. It's a nice touch. One funny thing, the active players have these little white clouds behind them as they move. That's how you can tell which player is active when you switch players. A lot of games will use a blinking effect or something to designate the active player. This game uses a little cloud, though to me it looks like they're farting, and that maybe the power of their farts is what's propelling them forward, kind of like how a jet plane works. This was developed by a company called Kitty, which seems pretty obscure. This whole game is kind of obscure. There are 0 reviews on GameFAQs, Moby Games doesn't even have an entry for it, and there's a relatively small number of videos on YouTube. It's not bad, it's just sort of generic and forgettable. It doesn't qualify as Kosogi, but it's certainly not memorable either. Every so often we will encounter a game that is simply inscrutable to me. A game absolutely far beyond my ken, and the most I can do is just show it to you. And today, this game is Best Play Pro Yakyuu 2, as every online source calls it, otherwise known as the Best Play Baseball 2, as the title screen and box art calls it. Developed and published by ASCII, this is the sequel to the 1988 original, which we undoubtedly covered some time ago. I can't remember exactly when. Now you're probably saying, wait a second, Dr. Sparkle, this is a baseball game. Obviously, this is an easy game to understand. All Famicom baseball games are exactly the same, right? Well, usually yes, but this one is a baseball simulation game, not an action baseball game. It mostly involves going through menus, making choices about your roster, and having your team play games, all of which are completely automated. You don't control the batter or any of the team members directly. So you start by selecting either the Celery League or the Parsley League, which are obviously references to the Central League and Pacific League, two parts of the Japanese Major League Baseball system. The names obliquely reference real-life teams. C team is the Carps, D team is the Dragons, G the Giants, and so on. There are tons of stats for your players and lots of options. This sort of reminds me of the horse racing game from last episode, in that you don't directly participate in the game, except that Best Play Baseball is even more graphically limited. There's very few graphics beyond what we see during the actual baseball game. I mean, there's nothing weird in here like buying tips from a guy in the toilet or anything like that. There's a lot of Japanese text in this, obviously, and even without the language barrier, I would simply have no idea how to run a successful baseball team. Ultimately, this is a game aimed at baseball stats nerds. Not my cup of tea, but there were a couple more games in this series released over the next year or two, so we will be coming back to this in the future. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we have a Konami game. And the bad news, well, it's actually a pretty irritating RPG. Mouryou Senki Madara. If nothing else, this intro is pretty rad. I mean, just take a look at this. It turns out this has had a full translation from none other than Gordon Z, so you can play through the whole darn thing if you choose. So wait a second, this involves dismembering a baby? And his missing limbs were replaced by robot limbs or something. It's not explicitly stated here, but in the manga, Madara's real dad, an evil emperor type, gave away his limbs to his generals, and Madara's mission is to retrieve his missing body parts, though after 15 years, I can't really imagine there would be much left of them. Right, so as we see here, this is not really a beautiful game. It's not as plain as Machine Hero Wataru, but it's not exactly very creative looking, and a number of things in this game just feel slightly off. The functions of the A and B buttons feel like they've been reversed. Whenever I went up to a character to talk to them, I'd instinctively hit the wrong button. And I was constantly opening the wrong menus and accidentally selecting things when I was trying to close a window, so the control scheme never became intuitive for me, and a lot of things just kind of confused me. Right, so what's going on is you and your girlfriend are on a mission to find the White Soma, which is needed to cure your adoptive father. You recruit the local tough guy to help you, and you have some very basic shops and an inn. The equipment in this game seems kind of boring and generic. You can purchase stuff like armor, and helmet, and a knife. Once you exit the village, you'll engage in combat in the form of random encounters, and here's where the game gets weird. I mean, the Wataru game had like this side view real-time fights like Zelda 2, but this game goes one step further and gives you top-down battles which are almost completely automated. When the encounter starts, your party and the enemies start moving towards each other, and the enemies simply start attacking you once they are in range. Now there's a few things you can do during the battle. For example, you can have a party member cast a spell. You can also pull up the tactics menu, though calling these tactics is a bit of an exaggeration. The default tactic for a character is fight, but you can also change them to run or defend or a number of other options. There's really not any sort of AI though. Your party members will always just march in a straight line towards their target and don't try to avoid any damage. So you might find yourself screaming at a party member who allows himself to get surrounded on both sides by enemies and will just stand there taking damage from both the front and the back. Also, enemy placement when you enter a battle is relatively random, so at the beginning of a fight, your weakest character might just have a couple monsters standing right next to them. There's always going to be an element of randomness in these fights. Now your first goal is to reach the Garden Point, which for some reason looks like a roiling brown cesspool on the world map. Once you enter it though, it turns out to be a forest. Now if you decide to play this game yourself, you will find you will absolutely hit a brick wall here, as upon entering Garden Point, you will encounter this spider guy who will just immediately kill you. You can't even avoid him by running away, as you will re-encounter him over and over again every time you take a step on the overworld. This actually reminds me of the Akuma-kun game, in which that you need to incessantly grind at the very beginning of the game before you can really advance the plot at all. This is definitely one of the worst beginnings of any JRPG I've played. So after fighting a bunch of trash enemies outside your hometown and making frequent trips to the inn, you will eventually become strong enough to kill the damn spider, and then you can finally explore Garden Point. I also stocked up on Soma, which is what the game calls most of your healing items. There are different colors of Soma. Some will refill your health, or they'll refill your MP, or cure status ailments, so on. Now luckily, the normal enemies wandering around aren't as tough as the spider. And then we eventually encounter a couple of the game's bad guys, one of whom looks like a rabbit. Also, the Soma can talk to you. You then enter this very simple dungeon-like area and find the rabbit guy who sicks his henchmen on you. And this is like the first official boss fight of the game. As I think I mentioned earlier, this is based on a manga. The Madara comic first debuted in 1987, and I get sort of an Akira vibe from this art style. An anime version followed soon, though it was released after this game came out. Taking a look at this thing, I guess gives us a better idea of what's going on in the game. Like, the dude whose sprite looks like a rabbit really is a rabbit?
Oh, you think so?
The writer of the Madara comic book, Eiji Otsuka, is an odd guy. Aside from comics and anime, he also wrote some sociological books on manga and otaku culture. He was apparently enough of an otaku expert that he testified at the trial of Tsutomu Miyazaki, aka the Otaku Murderer, a Japanese serial killer and pedophile who did a number of horrifying things which we will not discuss in this video, and I'd recommend that you don't look this guy up online either. Otsuka seems a little problematic, since he has also produced some Lolicon stuff, as well as regular comics. After getting the Soma and healing your dad, you find the bad guys have attacked your village, and wow, what a twist! I don't think I've ever heard of a JRPG where the hero's village gets attacked near the beginning of the game. Madara doesn't really seem like total trash, it's just there's a lot of things I don't like about it. The interface and inventory just seems awkward, and there's a lot of counterintuitive stuff in this game. Like when you check this character's stats, it says she has no spells. Yet, in battle, she can cast healing spells. Visually, the game is pretty boring. The manga references various names from Eastern religions. Soma, of course, is that ritual drink mentioned in the betas. And the name Madara seems to be a corruption of Matara, a Sanskrit word and perhaps a reference to a god from medieval Japan called Matara Jin. But the game itself just looks and feels like any generic RPG of the time. Its one strength, I suppose, is the music. The music is actually very good, and I think you almost might be better served like listening to the soundtrack of this game rather than trying to play it. If you search around on YouTube, of course, you'll find videos that have the complete soundtrack. So for JRPG fans, I guess this game might be kind of a disappointment, but don't worry, more interesting JRPGs will turn up before too long. Alright, we've got a couple game show games today. Let's start with Wheel of Fortune. Wait a sec, you say. Didn't we cover Wheel of Fortune a while back? And the answer is, yes, of course we did, you simpering fool. But this is not the regular boring version of Wheel of Fortune. This is Wheel of Fortune Family Edition, a brand new game developed by Rare and published by GameTech. The revolving letters is very much a giveaway that this is a Western-developed game. It's the kind of graphical trick that Rare loves inserting into their games. As you know, this is based on the long-running game show Wheel of Fortune, hosted by Pat Sajak and Vanna White, who had been hosting the real-life Wheel of Fortune since the 80s and continue to do so today. Up to 3 people can play, just like in the real Wheel of Fortune. If less than 3 people are playing, the computer will control the other opponents. Now I'm going to assume that everyone knows how Wheel of Fortune works, but just in case, here it is. Each player takes turns spinning the wheel, which determines how much money you get for each matching letter. You then choose a letter, and if you guessed a letter that is found in the puzzle, then you get money and get to spin again. You just keep repeating this until you guess incorrectly, or the wheel lands on bankrupt and you lose all your money. When it's your turn, you can also try to solve the puzzle instead of spinning. Man, Vanna isn't showing a lot of enthusiasm when she claps for the winner. Now you might be wondering, what is the difference between this game, the Family Edition, and the first Wheel of Fortune game originally released in 1988? The answer is absolutely nothing. Well, there have been some minor graphical changes, but other than that, it's exactly the same game. I'm not even sure why it's called Family Edition. Both the original and the Family Edition are for up to 3 players, and the original was pretty family friendly to begin with. You might remember there was a Wheel of Fortune Junior Edition released in 1989 that had easier puzzles and was aimed at kids. But Family Edition isn't dumbed down the way that one was. I mean, would kids know Greenwich, Connecticut? Whoever wins with the most money after 3 rounds goes into like the final round, where you pick 5 consonants and 1 vowel, and then you have a limited amount of time to guess the answer. And this one is pretty hard if you were not around in the 70s. Meadowlark Lemon was one of the most prominent of the Harlem Globetrotters at the time, along with Curly Neal. Unfortunately, if you win, GameTech will not send you the prize, so don't get too excited. If I'm not mistaken, there's another Wheel of Fortune game for the NES, so all you Rare fanatics will have that to look forward to. Next up, we have a couple of oddities, children's video games. Well, of course, all video games are made for children, or at least imbecilic adults, but Fisher-Price, Perfect Fit, and I Can Remember are clearly aimed at very young children. According to the manual, Perfect Fit is for children 3 to 8, and will supposedly help children develop quote-unquote skills in picture and shape recognition, spatial relationships, hand-eye coordination, and working within a time limit. Wow, sounds like they're training kids to work in a factory or something. Now, I doubt this game will make your kid any smarter. Humans have been pretty good at developing their understanding of spatial relationships and hand-eye coordination for many thousands of years, without the help of video games. However, these Fisher-Price games will allow parents to feel a little less guilty about buying their kids games, since these will make their kids smarter, rather than rotting their brains like regular video games. This kind of stuff was probably aimed at those parents who bought their kids those boring European toys. You remember there's always that one shop in the mall that sold like wooden, non-violent, gender-neutral toys from Finland that were supposedly so much healthier than American toys? Fisher-Price, as you know, was a major American toy manufacturer, noted for their simple, colorful, and durable plastic toys. Founded in 1930 by Herman Fisher and Irving Price, the company was probably best known in the 70s and 80s for their Little People line of playsets. They released a few video games on computers in the 1980s, but never really got big into the video game market. Perfect Fit was developed by Beam, but you know, this sort of thing looks right up Beam's alley. It's simple, utilitarian, no frills. All that's required is that it works. And in this case, Beam delivers. This is a functioning video game. It's very clear how to play it. They still managed to make it look kind of ugly though. Look at this text. Yeah, so obviously you play this by moving around the object using the D-pad, using the horizontal and or vertical flip icons to, flip the object so that it's correctly orientated. You can play against another person or the computer, and the computer, or Electro, as the game calls it, has this sort of dumb algorithm where it first tries to flip it vertically, then checks to see if it fits, and if it doesn't, then it flips it horizontally and then tries to fit it again. Perfect Fit isn't like a rare cartridge by any means, but it is a game that's rarely discussed, for obvious reasons. There's a surprising number of online playthroughs of this, however. There's a tool-assisted speedrun which clocks in at 4 minutes and 5 seconds, so there is some interest in this game. Anyway, let's continue talking about Fisher-Price games in the next segment. Hey, it's our second Fisher-Price game from Game Tech and Beam. I can remember. Just like Perfect Fit, it has this very lengthy set of instructions you can read, and this probably isn't necessary. And this is, once again, a game aimed at very young children, for 1 or 2 players. This is a standard variation on the old concentration game, where you flip 2 cards to reveal an image. If the image matches, you win the pair of cards. It's uncommon to get a matching pair purely by luck. Usually you will win cards by flipping a card, then later finding its match and remembering where the first card was. So it's basically a memory game. I don't know why I'm explaining this to you, I'm sure you know how this game works. The popular Fisher-Price little people appear in the bottom corners of the screen, you may have noticed. As I mentioned with Perfect Fit, there really isn't much interest in these games, and for a good reason. It's a very simple game that really isn't very engaging to anyone over the age of 7 or so. I Can Remember is not anyone's passion project. It was a purely mercenary game, created simply as an entry point into the world of video games for Fisher-Price, and of course that didn't even work out. But I still find these forgotten games a little intriguing, just because I don't know anything about them going in. We can throw together children's games or girl games or just forgotten cash-in games into a pseudo-genre of overlooked video games. If this channel was more pretentious, I might call these like liminal games or some such nonsense. I suspect that as we make progress into the 90s, we'll see more of this kind of thing, as every Tom, Dick, or Harry decides to throw their hat into the Nintendo ring. Oh, and speaking of cash-in games, our next game is a quite bizarre example of this. Okay folks, if you thought we had some bad games so far this episode, just wait till you get a load of this one. Target Renegade is a weird one, a pseudo-sequel to Renegade, Taito's 1986 arcade beat-em-up. This was originally made for the British market, as we'll see in a moment. So your brother is kidnapped by punks, or more specifically, he's kidnapped by a gang run by a dude called Mr. Big. You've got to walk across town and get your brother back. So here's the thing, you remember those motorcycle guys in that one level in Renegade? Everyone hated those, right? You had to jump at them at just the right moment to kick them off their bikes? Well, Target Renegade decided, hey, let's start the game off with those motorcycle guys. It's like literally the first enemy you see in the game, and after you take care of a few of them, then there's more, they just keep coming. And the running jump is so finicky. In the first game you just had to run towards the cycle and press A and B simultaneously to perform the jump. In Target Renegade you jump by pressing up on the D-pad, then pressing the A button to kick, which can be tricky if you're already moving the D-pad to move your character around. And the timing required to actually make contact with these guys is really weird. Just look at this, you have to kick the air in front of the motorcycle guy. Otherwise your foot will just pass harmlessly right through his head, and you'll take damage. I mean, look at this. This right here is a hit, and this is not. However, you can also kill them by hitting the air behind them with your foot. And then of course the second level also starts off with motorcycle dudes, and they show up a third time in a later level. Like many games, health refills can be dropped by enemies, but in most fighting games you can typically just walk over the health item and pick it up. But here, nope. You have to stand right on top of the heart, press down the A button, and also make sure that you're positioned in exactly the right spot so that your fist touches the heart as you bend down. This seems like an excessively finicky process to get a health refill in an action game like this, where standing still for even a second or two can result in you getting hit. Now, unlike Renegade, Target Renegade has clearly defined levels and bosses at the end of each level. Here's the first one. This boss, and the next one, will frequently perform a very sudden kick that will take off around half of your life bar, which is pretty annoying. Now, you might wonder, what the heck is the deal with this game? It's a Kunio-kun game, but it's not a real Kunio-kun game? It's British? What's going on? So, the first Kunio-kun game, known as Renegade outside of Japan, was a huge international success and ported to many platforms, including various British computers, published by such companies like Majin and The Hit Squad, which was a sub-label of Ocean Software. The huge success of Renegade on British computers led to Majin tossing out a sequel developed by Ocean, which looked very similar to the computer versions of the original Renegade. Target Renegade was immensely popular, and while you and I might consider this to be an unplayable piece of garbage, it was highly acclaimed in the UK. A 1993 readers' poll in Your Sinclair magazine placed it as the 13th greatest video game of all time. Taito, who was perhaps starved for content, released this in the US for the NES, ported by the Manchester-based Software Creations. Taito also borrowed Imagine's box art, which by the way was lifted from this photo of Joe Louis, the American kickboxer and karate champion, who is generally considered to be one of the greatest karate fighters and kickboxers of all time. And by the way, there was a third British Renegade game in which Renegade Guy travels through different historical eras and fights cavemen and medieval knights and such. Thankfully, this did not get an NES port, so we can safely ignore it. When discussing Target Renegade, typically one is required to point out the huge disparity in quality between the game and the music. And yeah, the music by Tim Fallon is quite good. Fallon, as you know, had a career producing high-quality music for forgettable games, like Silver Surfer or Pictionary. There are, of course, exceptions, like Rock and Roll Racing, or the Dreamcast Echo the Dolphin game, and we actually have another game with a Tim Fallon soundtrack coming up in just a moment. So aside from Target Renegade's wonky controls, the game suffers from having a very repetitive structure. There's 7 levels, and the first 6 are very similar to each other. Each consists of 3 screens. When each level starts, some enemies come after you. Once you've knocked them all out, you go on to the next screen. Basically repeat, then move on to the 3rd screen where you fight the boss. The guy who throws tires at you is the boss for both levels 1 and 2, and then you have this tall guy in level 3. Then this giant chick is the boss in levels 4 and 5. All 3 bosses are pretty similar in that you fight them with hit-and-run tactics. Walk up to them, give them a punch or a kick, and then back up before they can retaliate. The actual level design is pretty boring. The first 3 take place in a parking garage. Level 4 is quote-unquote downtown. 5 is a park, and level 6 is also downtown. And level 7 is the boss's lair. By 1990 standards, the game's structure is very simple compared to other beat-em-ups of this time, like Double Dragon 2 or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And to be fair, this is a port of a 1988 game, but even the original Renegade had more variety. Like in the first level, you started off on the subway platform, and then you boarded the train, then fought guys on the train, and then got off and fought a boss at the next station. And the environment was actually part of the game, unlike in Target Renegade, where it's purely a backdrop. For example, on the dock level, you can defeat enemies by knocking them into the water, and after taking down the motorcycle dudes, you jump on a bike, and there's a short driving section. Target Renegade has nothing that approaches this level of creativity. Another very bizarre decision is how the character death is handled. Usually when you die in a game, you get like a death animation, or your character collapses to the ground or explodes, and often a little sound effect plays, and then a moment later the screen will fade out. Here, however, when you get hit by an attack that drops your health below 0, the very instant that your sprite changes to the taking damage sprite, the game freezes and quickly fades to black. And this is very quick, like the whole thing is like maybe 10 frames. It's actually very surprising the first time this happens. I thought it was a bug or the game accidentally reset itself. The whole way this is handled is just so weird. Now for the most part, you really only need one attack in the game, the ankle kick. The manual calls it a foot sweep, but it takes out enemies faster than punches or kicks. You just hold the down button and mash the A button, and most bad guys are toast. So in this game's favor, it does switch it up a bit at the end. The guy who kidnapped your brother, Mr. Big, has a bar. Before you can enter, you must fight off his 2 waiters, I guess? The trick here is actually pretty simple. You just need to move out of the way if they try to surround you. Otherwise, they will pound you into jello from both sides simultaneously. You'll then enter Mr. Big's bar, the Pigpen, where you fight some more generic thugs, then Mr. Big himself. And there is one joke that I like in this game. There's the 3 restroom doors labeled Women, Men, and Mr. Big. Obviously, Mr. Big isn't very large, but he does have a comically oversized gun and can hit pretty hard. He will also throw pink knives at you. Once again, our good friend the ankle kick will take care of this guy. If you're wondering whether there's any sort of like cutscene that wraps up the story or any credits or anything, the answer is no, of course not. This is probably the worst beat 'em up we've seen in a while, and remember, this was released in the US 3 months after River City Ransom, so kids who were familiar with that game would have been pretty disappointed. Well, moving right along, we have another port by Software Creations. Oh boy, we've got another game from the British company Software Creations, and you know what that means, a lousy game with a banging soundtrack by Tim Fallon. Seriously though, check this out. Okay, so Magic Johnson's Fast Break is a little-loved baseball game which licensed the name and likeness of Magic Johnson, and it seems to be sponsored by Pepsi. Johnson is of course one of the all-time greats in the field of pro basketball. During the 1980s, the team of Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were almost unstoppable, giving the Lakers 5 championship wins in the decade. In 1989, Johnson received his second NBA MVP award, and in 1990 he would collect another, so he was a very hot property at this time. I'm sure a lot of people played this back in the day, but I assume many didn't like it. There's a lot of basketball games for the NES, and this one probably wouldn't be anyone's first choice. In terms of gameplay, the only distinguishing factor is that it has the option for 4 players. And if you were a dumb kid back in the early 90s, I can see how this would entertain you for a bit. Now, you might not know this, but this is actually a port of a 1988 arcade game, though not one that you are likely to have ever played, since it's quite rare. In 1987, Mastertronic, the highly successful British producer of super cheap computer games for systems like the Spectrum and the Commodore 64, decided to branch out into arcade games. So they actually set up a company in California called Arcadia Systems. And the thing was, their arcade machines were basically modified Amiga computers, in order to save on manufacturing costs, I assume. The project failed miserably, but they did publish a couple games for the NES, including one beloved classic. Arcadia Systems didn't produce this port, however. It was developed by Software Creations and published by TradeWest. In terms of basketball games, this is relatively stripped down. You run around, pass, shoot, steal, the usual stuff. All 4 players have the exact same sprite. Oh, and that cool music that you hear during the intro, that does not appear anywhere during the game itself, which instead just uses some really ugly sounding sound effects. Johnson himself seems to be acting as the referee, though he also gives you encouragement and tips, which is probably against NBA regulations. If you play against the computer, you'll be in for a rather odd experience. The CPU is very fast and agile. It will nab the ball away from you effortlessly. But it's also pretty stupid. You can stand right in front of its teammates and basically he'll just throw the ball right at you. Another weird factor is that the percentage of shots that go into the basket is pretty high, and even scoring 3-pointers is relatively easy. It's a bit funny, I came across a forum thread about the best NES basketball games, and in the approximately 40 replies, one person said they liked Magic Johnson's Fast Break. So while I can't recommend the game, I would recommend that you check out the music. If you were a fan of the digitized photos from A Boy and His Blob, then you'll love the title screen of Win, Lose, or Draw. Once again, we have our good buddies High-Tech Expressions putting this thing out. You'll remember them from Chessmaster a couple episodes ago. This is based on the late 80s, early 90s game show developed by Burt Reynolds and Burt Convy. Convy was an actor and game show host in the 70s and 80s. He had previously hosted Super Password and Tattletales. Burt Reynolds was, of course, Burt Reynolds. The set was modeled on Reynolds' own living room, and the pilot, seen here, featured both Burts, Tony Danza, Betty White, and Lonnie Anderson. Teams were divided into males and females, with each team composed of celebrities and normal non-celeb contestants. There's a number of gameplay options. Perhaps the most significant is the drawing mode, as we'll see later. If you're not familiar with the rules of Win, Lose, or Draw, here's how it goes. Each team takes turns drawing. The team that's up will have one of the members read a card with a word on it. Then the person must draw something while their team tries to guess the clue. No verbal clues can be given. The word must be conveyed solely through drawing. If the team fails to guess the clue within the time limit, then the opposing team can make a guess. So it's essentially just charades, except using a pen and paper instead of gestures. Now, one problem. Win, Lose, or Draw just doesn't translate very well to a video game, because the game's distinctive feature, drawing is just hard to do using an NES controller. Much of the appeal of the game show is that most people can't draw very well, and the fun comes from trying to decipher their poorly thought out scribbles, which will always need to be revised and clarified by the artist when their team is yelling out all kinds of totally incorrect answers. Now, one of the drawing modes is automatic, and when you use this mode, the computer slowly draws a pretty clear rendering of the clue. I mean, they're designed to look amateurish, but you can always tell what it's supposed to be. So this turns the game into essentially just trying to predict what the computer is drawing before the drawing is complete. On the other hand, using the manual drawing mode means you are going to try to draw recognizable pictures with the NES D-pad, which is, I mean, maybe with a certain amount of practice, it's possible. But for the most part, though, I mean, trying to draw pictures with this thing is just going to be a huge pain in the ass. Win, Lose, or Draw was pretty popular in its board game format. It was a pretty popular party game along with Pictionary, and had the benefit of using an actual pen and paper to draw with. Now, this was not the first video game version of Win, Lose, or Draw. It was first released for computers by High Tech Expressions in 1988, and was developed by Softy, a company that seemed to specialize in game show video games. They also adapted Family Feud, Remote Control, and a few of the Wheel of Fortune games. Now, the NES version looks substantially different than the computer versions and was developed by a company called RSP, Rydell Software Productions. Founded by a former Atari employee named Michael Rydell and Vince Desi, who handled the business end of the company. RSP made a number of family-friendly games, including a Sesame Street game for the NES, which we'll eventually cover. However, they are mostly known now for their spin-off company, Running with Scissors, maker of the Postal games. For those of you unaware of the Postal series, essentially both it and Saints Row are the children of Grand Theft Auto 3, but Saints Row is the handsome, rich, well-loved son, and Postal is the ugly, unemployed, ne'er-do-well son with a serious substance abuse problem. Running with Scissors was actually sued by the US Postal Service over the Postal name. So, Win, Lose, or Draw isn't exactly bad, it just doesn't work very well as a video game. However, that's not going to stop LJN from releasing a Pictionary game a few months down the road. Alright, well, we're almost done for today. Let's wrap this up with Burai Fighter, a Japanese release that came out in the US several months before it did in Japan. Not sure why, but it was no huge loss on Japan's part. Burai Fighter is an odd little shoot-'em-up. It's a mech-based game, at least in the Japanese version, where the box art clearly depicts a Gundam-style robot. The US art shows the protagonist in just a helmet and a jetpack. This was developed by Disco, a subsidiary of Taito, and published by Taito in Japan. And in the US, of course, it was released by Taxon, which is simply another division of Maxit. In Europe, this was released by Nintendo themselves. Burai Fighter has an unusual control scheme for your weapons. Normally, your weapon fires in whatever direction you're moving. However, holding down on the B button will fire continuously while locking down the direction of your fire. And this is absolutely vital in this game. For example, the first boss. He has one weak spot, right in the middle. You'll need to lock down your weapons to fire towards the left while moving around in various directions, avoiding all the guys that come at you. You have three types of weapons. The laser, which is pretty powerful and fires in just a straight line. and slices right through enemies and keeps going. You also have the ring, which doesn't do as much damage to enemies, but has the advantage of passing through walls, and there are quite a few walls in Burai Fighter. Finally, missiles are the most powerful weapon, but they explode when they hit an enemy or a wall, so you can't tear through multiple enemies like the laser. Every time you collect a weapon pickup, it switches to that weapon and raises the level of the weapon by 1. As you can imagine, leveling up weapons makes them do things like fire in multiple directions and such. Each weapon can be raised to level 10. Once a weapon is maxed out, you are basically a flying wall of death. Another interesting weapon is the bomb. These things set off a huge explosion, killing tons of on-screen enemies. You get bombs by collecting bomb fragments, which will eventually coalesce into a bomb once you have enough of the fragments. Enemies also like setting off huge bombs while they're near you, which will waste you if you don't get out of the way very quickly. The second boss is a spider with revolving sphere arms that you must avoid. Shooting the dude in the face does not do anything. You must hit those little pulsing globes by his butt. Burai Fighter is not a bad-looking game. For example, look at this creepy level with all those weird kelp things wafting back and forth on the ceiling and floor. Burai Fighter likes sending you through tight passages and corridors. This game can be pretty claustrophobic at times. This boss is one of those big snake bosses where you have to shoot at certain weak spots. He breaks up into smaller snakes, which you then have to kill. And I was okay with Burai Fighter up to this level, in which the boss is hidden somewhere in this giant, looping, empty space, and you need to just sort of fly around until you happen to run into them. Though watching the video footage now, I see that it does briefly show you a map of the level at the very beginning. So Burai Fighter is sort of an okay shoot 'em up. I don't know, there's definitely better shooters coming up in 1990 than this. Wow, okay, we really plumbed the depths today. But at least we had a bit of variety. We had boring games of every type and genre. Best game? I'm gonna take a pass on this one. I can't say there was anything here that I would ever want to revisit. Worst game? I'm gonna be spiteful and go with Target Renegade. While it's technically competent in some areas, it just feels like a betrayal. It slanders the good name of Renegade. It tricks you into thinking you'll be getting like a Technos Japan beat-em-up, and you end up with something from the guys behind the NES Wolverine game. So next episode, man, 2 huge games, a Tecmo action game and a Zelda-style adventure from SNK. It's going to be a packed episode. Once we're done with episodes 59 and 60, we might just turn our attention to a Chron Sega or a Chron Turbo episode. And once again, thanks to all the patrons who are instrumental in keeping these things rolling off the pipeline.